All right, everybody, welcome to the Rowan College of Burlington County, hereafter referred to by our acronym RCBC Global Studies Lecture Series. This is a continuation of a series of conversations that started in fall 2020 in global health, environment, and global political economy and security, and key international issues affecting those. This is partially sponsored by the U.S. Department of Education's Undergraduate International Studies in Foreign Language Grant Program. This is a multi-year grant that our partner institution, Rowan University, and us, RCBC, have received to build global and international studies designations and degree programs, and also courses in high-demand languages such as Arabic and Chinese language, along with student activities reflecting these initiatives. This event is also hosted by RCBC, a mid-sized 2- and 3-year college in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, serving the geographically largest county in New Jersey. With anywhere from 7,000 to 10,000 students each semester. Our college has one of the most ethnically diverse student bodies in the state and region, with one of the lowest tuition costs as well. We offer a diverse array of degree and certificate programs across numerous academic and workforce-focused disciplines, including our forthcoming Global Studies degree designation. Many students stay for a third year in our innovative 3+1 programs, whereby students can earn a 4-year degree at highly reduced cost. And this is also hopefully an appropriate host institution for such a series on international issues, as RCBC has one of the most diverse student bodies based on major demographic characteristics such as ethnic background and country of origin of students. I'm your host for this event and this series. I'm Brandon Chapman, instructor and department chair of Anthropology and Sociology at the college, and also project director of the grant at the college, the previously mentioned Department of Education grant. The goal of the lecture series is to bring to our campus and here this evening our virtual WebEx campus, top-level scholars, academics, researchers, and industry professionals at all levels of career, early, mid, and late career that are experienced, knowledgeable experts in global health, environment, and political economy and international security issues. And of course, to develop this knowledge and skill in our students at both Rowan University and RCBC, and to have a dynamic conversation about key global issues within these areas, and to give our students such avenues to advance their training in these topics. Look for more of these events in the future. We've had a long list of speakers, luckily, this fall semester, and we will have the final event in this semester in our series just less than 4 weeks from today, on Thursday, November 11th, just for your planning purposes. I know we have some folks in the audience that attend this series regularly. We've had Many of our events have been surrounding and focusing on U.S.-China relations, and so we're going to continue that on November 11th. Dr. Aaron Friedberg, also from Princeton University, professor of politics there, is going to be my guest, and we will talk about the past, present, and future of U.S.-China military and diplomatic relations. This evening, we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Stephen Kotkin. He is heard a lot of introductions in his career, so he'll have to hear another one, I suppose. He is John Birkelund, professor in history and international affairs at Princeton University, up the road from us, and also a longtime fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He has a long publication career as a Russian and Soviet historian, and if you want to understand the nature of authoritarianism, despotism, and the nature of power accumulation in such societies, I can think of no better works than his recent masterful volumes on the life of Joseph Stalin. He's also a global historian of world renown, and I think this evening he may be talking with us about global political economic trends as he researches that as a global historian as well. He's also going to be giving our the talk this evening titled "What World Do We Live In?", which is a straightforward and perhaps a bit provocative title, as Dr. Kotkin can be. We are very intrigued and looking forward to this event. Our moderator for this evening is Dr. James Heinzen. He is a professor of history at Rowan University in Glassboro, and he's an appropriate he's also the director of the Hollybush Institute there for Global Peace and Security, where he oversees research efforts and student and public events and guest speakers under those topics. Dr. Heinzen is an appropriate moderator for this event as he has overlap in research interests with Dr. Kotkin, He's also a historian of the Soviet era and also modern Russia. He also has a list of book and other journal article publications over the past few decades, and he's most recently looked at corruption during the Stalin era of the Soviet Empire, and also the state power and the nature of that in early Soviet era Russia. He also teaches numerous undergraduate courses on Russian and Soviet history, the Cold War, historical methods, and European history. A note on format, just quickly before I turn it over to our moderator. We've never really had any logistical issues in this series with any interruptions of that sort of thing. But just a reminder, if there is any unintentional unmuting, I do have the power to put you on mute, but we shouldn't have any issues with that. And hopefully we'll have a little more noise when we have our discussion questions near the end of our session, and you all can get to ask questions of our guests here. So with that, let's welcome then, and I'll turn it over to our moderator, Dr. James Heinzen. So, Jim, go ahead.
Thanks, Brandon. So I'm Jim Heinzen. I'm a professor in the history department at Rowan, and I'm the director of the Holly Bush Institute for Global Peace and Security at Rowan. It's a real pleasure to have Steve Kotkin be able to come to our campuses and speak to our communities. Steve and I first became acquainted in the early 90s when we worked together for a few years. And during that time and in the subsequent years, I came to admire Steve's work for many things, but I just want to very quickly mention three. First of all, he's a person who's completely committed to his work, or to put it another way, he is completely unafraid of the conclusions to which he comes through his research, no matter how iconoclastic or sometimes unpopular, and he really backs down from nothing intellectually. And you may notice this evening in some of his comments which will possibly challenge some of your most cherished convictions. Secondly, something that makes his writing so appealing and so popular and able to reach such a large audience is that it's crafted with extraordinary care, and I can't recommend his books enough. You can see this in his books and his eye for the telling detail about the people and the events he describes, but also even down to things like the titles of his chapters, which are often very humorous and noteworthy. Even the photos he selects to illustrate his books, and even the captions to those photographs, which are always a pleasure to read. They're often themselves little tiny mini essays of 1 or 2 sentences on the topic at hand. And finally, he's one of the few historians that I know that, and I think this is how I really think of Steve more than in any other way, is that he has the ability to weave together history, geopolitics, and institutions while still maintaining a great respect for the humanity of his subjects. And this ability makes him a masterful historian of power. Power as an idea, power as it is expressed in ideology, power as it is exercised by states and people in every possible way. And his study of Stalin, which Brandon mentioned, is, in my view, a natural culmination of this lifetime project. And by the way, here is a copy of Volume 2 of the projected 3-volume History of Stalin that Professor Kotkin is writing right now. The first volume of this was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction in 2014. But these talents taken all together are a major reason why Steve Kotkin is such a highly sought after commentator on current affairs and on the state of the globe today, to which he applies these same skills. And we're very fortunate to have him speak to us tonight, and I'm now very happy to turn over the floor to Professor Stephen Kotkin.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brandon, for the honor of the invitation. Thank you, Jim, for that over-the-top introduction. I have heard many introductions, but I wouldn't mind watching the recording of that one. That was really sweet. I appreciate that. I'm going to talk today about some things I didn't fully understand. Years ago when I published some of my books, and I've changed my mind, and I've revised my thinking. I'm going to contrast for you the importance of 1989 versus the importance of 1979. And I'm also going to talk about how the world has dead-ended in many of the big structures, and that the way forward could be very bumpy and difficult. So let me begin by talking about 1989, 1991. That's the time, as you know, of the fall of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, not in East Asia. It's the so-called end of the Cold War in Europe, but not in East Asia, and maybe not even in Europe. The three big trends that I would like to point to of 1989-91 are pretty obvious. One is, as I said, the dissolution of the Soviet Union into 15 Union republics. The Soviet Union was a voluntary federation of states, of republics. The federation was overridden by the Communist Party pyramid. When the party was weakened, largely on purpose by Mikhail Gorbachev, the constituent elements of the Union broke away, and not only did the Communist Party fall, but the Union dissolved. The second is the unification of Germany, which was part and parcel of this process, because East Germany was inside the Soviet bloc, whereas West Germany was in the Western Alliance, NATO. The Soviet Union had 650,000 troops in occupying Eastern Europe, including 400,000 in East Germany alone. To understand those numbers, the highest troop level that the Soviets ever achieved in 10 years in Afghanistan was 110,000 troops. And they had 650,000 in Eastern Europe, 400,000 in East Germany. The unification of Germany, and then third, the fall of apartheid, the apartheid regime in South Africa, which happened also right around the time of the Soviet collapse, and which was related to the Soviet collapse in many ways. Those of us who were alive at the time, that doesn't include many of you as my guests, but it certainly includes myself. Those of us alive at the time viewed these events as momentous. We understood them to be a massive turning point in world history, the end of one epoch and the opening of another epoch. But as I alluded to earlier, I've come to revise this view. The collapse of the Soviet Union in the fullness of time looks more like a temporary diminution, a temporary decrease in the power of Russia, but Russia has come back as something of a great power, not on the scale of the Soviet Union by any means, a smaller country, a country that doesn't have the power that the Soviets one time had, but nonetheless, Russia is back. The unification of Germany, which looked like a momentous event that was also epochal, also a major turning point, has turned out to be a little bit of a dud. That is to say, Germany punches way below its weight geopolitically, and although the European Union did expand into the former Soviet territories, Germany has not become a significantly bigger great power as a result of the unification. South African apartheid's fall also looked like a major turning point. However, the evolution of South Africa since then has presented many challenges for the South African people, especially for the African National Congress and its rule since Mandela passed away. So if you put these things together, they have receded or decreased in time in terms of how momentous their consequences have been for the rest of the world, as well as for their own regions. This is not to say they weren't big. They are very big. The fall of apartheid in South Africa was big. The fall of communism in the Soviet Union was big. The unification of Germany and the expansion of the EU, these were big events. If you live in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, which is now Czechia and Slovakia, if you live in Southern Africa, if you live in many of the places directly affected, you're likely to still regard them as momentous. And certainly for the black population of South Africa or for the population of the Baltic states, they will always remain momentous in some ways. But I would argue that they were not as momentous as we perceived, and certainly far less momentous than previous events which happened in 1979 and are still with us in a much bigger and more important way. So I'm not suggesting nothing happened in 1989, nor am I suggesting that the fall of the apartheid regime or the fall of communism and the independence of the Baltic states is something small or unimportant. Quite the contrary. I'm just suggesting that we overestimated the importance in real time, and I've come to see a diminishment in that importance over time. Let's take 1979 for a moment. In 1979, what happened? Well, we had the Iranian Revolution. The Shah was overthrown, and Khomeini, a cleric, returned to Iran from France, and over time, not immediately, but over time, in the Iranian Revolution, in the overthrow of the Shah, Khomeini led a process which implanted a theocracy, an Islamic republic in Iran. That Islamic republic is still with us today. It had Islamism, not the rule of Muslims in a Muslim country, but Islamism, which is a special form of a theocracy, is Islamic rule, not necessarily a general version, but specific to the Iranian Revolution. But nonetheless, it began to spread, including in a place called Afghanistan. It influenced events in Pakistan. It influenced events greatly in Saudi Arabia, opening up a massive proxy war between Sunni Arab regimes and the Shiite regimes represented by Iran and its militias in neighboring countries, which is all still with us today. The Grand Mosque in Saudi Arabia was actually captured in 1979 by Islamists, leading to a change in Saudi Arabia towards a more theocratic regime where Wahhabism became more deeply institutionalized along with the ruling Saud family. And so the repercussions of the Iranian regime were enormous, and moreover, they have not decreased over time, which is part of my argument. Another thing that happened in 1979 was Deng Xiaoping's launching of reform in China, and his visit to the United States. You'll know that Mao died in 1976 when the Cultural Revolution convulsion, which Mao imposed on China, came to an end. There was a power struggle. Deng Xiaoping came back to power, came in the sense of he was rehabilitated politically, and he was able to become the paramount leader. And instead of reinstituting Maoist-style politics and economics, he began a process of reform which opened up the country, first the economy to market economics, and then opening China to the world. Nixon went to China in 1973 with his aide, Henry Kissinger. That's considered the great opening of China, but in fact, neither Nixon nor Mao during that visit were interested in trade. Deng Xiaoping went to the United States in 1979, and he was deeply interested in trade, and he met with Jimmy Carter, the first communist China leader who had ever visited the United States. He put on his 10-gallon cowboy hat, and he began a process of rapprochement, or better relations with the United States at the expense of relations with the still then communist Soviet Union. Why did he do this? Well, if you look over the water, there's Japan from Deng Xiaoping's vantage point, and Japan had been absolutely destroyed in World War II, literally incinerated, including by nuclear weapons, had lost the war, but then from the ashes of the defeat in World War II, Japan had risen to become what was eventually the second largest economy in the world after the United States, and today is the third largest behind China, second, and the United States. And Deng Xiaoping watched Japan produce manufactured goods, which were then exported to the United States middle class. The insatiable consumer appetites of the United States middle class. And Japan rose from the ashes and became rich based upon this economic model, which was just across the water from Deng Xiaoping, China. And so what Deng did was to begin that process in communist China. Japan had done it first. Taiwan and South Korea had followed the model, which was to say manufacture goods to export into the U.S. domestic market and grow your own middle class by selling goods to the American middle class. Not everybody could achieve this. For example, Romania never had goods that the American middle class was interested in buying. Neither did Poland, neither did Hungary. But the East Asian tigers, as they're sometimes called, they managed to produce goods at low cost and high quality that the American middle class was very happy to purchase. Deng followed this exact model, more or less, using the advantage of having Hong Kong, a British possession until 1997, which was a global financial center with the rule of law and property rights that funneled the foreign domestic investment from Japan and Taiwan into southern China and began this economic boom, which is just breathtaking, absolutely breathtaking, that communist China has undergone now for almost 4 decades and resulted in them vaulting from an economy that was per capita $200 per year to an economy that's per capita is $10,000 per year. So China went from a very poor, undeveloped country, convulsed in violence because of the Maoist regime, to a high middle income country, which is what it is today, the Deng Xiaoping revolution. And those consequences are still with us and still unfolding. China is in motion today. I could say a lot more about this, but I want to move to my third 1979 important process, which is the Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan market revolution in Great Britain and the United States. The 1970s in Great Britain and the United States were eras of stagnation and inflation. This combination was supposed to have been impossible, and we had to coin a new term, stagflation, for stagnation, inflation. You were never supposed, when you stagnated, prices were not supposed to rise, and when prices rose, you were not supposed to stagnate. There were also many other things besides stagflation. There was the oil shock in the United States in 1973, when we had lines for gasoline, which your parents will remember. There was the loss of the war in Vietnam when Saigon was taken by the North Korean regime. They won the Vietnam War. After the United States left in 1973, Saigon was taken by the North Korean communists in 1975. There were minor strikes and paralysis of the transport network in the UK, where Margaret Thatcher became the prime minister at the end of the 70s. There was a sense in which the West, especially two of its leading countries and its greatest power, the United States, were unraveling, and Thatcher and Reagan came along and introduced privatization of national industries and deregulation of market economies, and changed fundamentally the economic and political realities and debates in those two really important powers, the Anglo-American world. This was so significant that following Thatcher and Reagan's market deregulation, privatization revolution, the left in both the UK and the US moved very far from the left to the center. And Bill Clinton, who came to office in the early 90s, talked about being a new kind of Democrat, a centrist Democrat, where the era of big government was over. Tony Blair in the UK did something very, very similar, calling himself New Labour, moving to the center, repudiating the leftism of Labour from the 1970s. And so the Reagan-Thatcher revolution moved the opposition, the Labour Party and the Democrat in the UK, the Democratic Party in the US, very far from left to center. And so the consequences of the Reagan-Thatcher market revolution are in some ways also still with us, although there are recent new developments that I'll talk about in a second. If you put together the Iranian Revolution and Islamic regimes and the consequences of that across the Middle East and Inner Asia, if you put together Deng Xiaoping and the opening up economically of China, not politically but economically, but also geopolitically, a de facto economic alliance with the United States, and the Reagan-Thatcher market revolution in the Anglo-American sphere, you have three developments whose consequences played out in many ways much more significantly than what happened in 1989. And so 1979, I've now come to conclude, after believing differently, potentially is the world we live in, and that 1989, however important, and it was important, is really in the shadow to this day of 1979. I could add more to 1979 even than Iranian Islamic Revolution, Deng Xiaoping liberalization of communist China and opening to America, or the Reagan-Thatcher market revolution. I could add the coming to power in Poland of the first Polish Pope ever, and the first non-Italian Pope in something like 450 years, and his call for a reclaiming of traditional values, which I believe was also a major uprising in world affairs and is still with us playing out today. But I'll leave that aside for debate. If I'll hold only to the first three, Iran, China, and the Anglo-American sphere. Now, I would further argue not only that this was extremely consequential, but that each of these three eruptions of 1979 have dead-ended. They have reached the dead end. They have reached their ability to succeed or move the world, despite the fact that they did move the world, for better or for worse. I'm not taking a position on whether they were good or bad. I'm just saying they were consequential. But I'm saying that their consequences have dead-ended in many ways. The Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution, can be considered in many ways to have dead-ended. The populace, especially the young populace, is not happy with living under this regime, and in many ways the regime has had to increase its level of repression and destroy, undermine its neighbors throughout the region in order to survive. I think the regime is living on borrowed time, potentially, but certainly it's creating great havoc because it has legitimacy problems and because it's very calcified at this point. The mullahs, who were revolutionaries, have become status quo kleptocrats, employing repression on a scale as great or greater than the Shah, whom they overthrew. Deng Xiaoping's revolution, which could be called market Leninism or the Leninist market, combining a Communist Party monopoly in politics with some liberalization, some legalization of the private sector in the economy, also seems to have hit something of a dead end. The party, which needs the private sector for GDP growth and job creation, the party for its legitimacy, for its stability, cannot live without the private sector, but the party can also not live with the private sector because the private sector's accumulation of wealth is a source of independent power that threatens the Communist Party monopoly. Lately, we have seen, as I predicted, the Communist Party cracking down on the private sector, strangling the private sector, destroying more than $1 trillion of wealth in the last several months alone, and I believe there's more to come, because the party's ability to maintain its monopoly control of the country, as I said, is threatened by the independent wealth and power of the dynamic private sector, which accounts for 80% of GDP growth and job creation. Can't live with the private sector anymore, but can't live without it for the job growth and the stability of the country. I believe it has dead-ended. The Reagan-Thatcher revolution dead-ended in large part because it was successful in deregulating and privatizing the economy such that the challenges in front of the further generations of conservative politicians were no longer that too much industry was nationalized, too much of the economy was regulated, too much stagflation because growth boomed and inflation was ended, so that the initial starting point that seemed to motivate the Reagan-Thatcher revolution was no longer there, because the Reagan-Thatcher revolution had the massive consequences that I suggested. And so the Reagan-Thatcher revolution hollowed out, which enabled a takeover of the hollow conservative party by President Donald Trump. You can't take over something that's extremely strong, but you can take it over more easily if it's hollowed out. In addition, the consequences of forcing the left into the center no longer hold, and the Democratic Party and the Labor Party both moved very strongly back to the left, another sign that the Reagan-Thatcher revolution hollowed itself out by its own successes in implementing the policies that it sought to implement. You can judge these morally and politically any way you want. You can be against or in favor of the Islamic Revolution. You can be against or in favor of Deng Xiaoping's reform of communist China. You can be against or in favor of the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. I'm arguing neither side. This is not a political or a moral argument. I'm making a geopolitical and an institutional and ultimately an ideas or ideational argument about the consequences of the developments of that year and how big they are and how that's the world we live in. But tragically, we live within those structures, but those structures have hollowed out, and we need different solutions going forward. Russia is back, and the importance of 1989 over time does not look as great. In fact, the idea that the Cold War ended in Europe looks quite different today than it did in 1989-91. And of course, as I suggested, neither communism nor the Cold War has ended in East Asia. The Korean Peninsula is still divided, and mainland China is still communist, and Taiwan is still the refuge for the non-communist Republican China regime that fled there in 1949 when the communists came to power in mainland China. So if you put this argument together, whether you agree or disagree, you have to admit that the consequences of 79 were potentially overshadowed by our fixation on 89, and that even if we uphold 89 as consequential, we need a more complex, qualified argument to take into account the fact that Russia is back potentially. Germany unification did not have the consequences we expected. The post-apartheid regime in South Africa has run into some rocky road, some troubled waters. The Iranian Revolution continues to fixate and unfold, even though I argue it's hollow. The China story is the biggest story in the world in many ways, although one could also argue that the Anglo-American changes are as big and as consequential as the Chinese changes, and maybe even more consequential than the German story, the Soviet story, and the South African story. Jim, I think I'll leave it at that. There's much more to say, but I'd like to elaborate in response to the questions of your students and see if we can open up, if they agree or disagree, and maybe even open up other topics that they might be interested that I didn't even cover. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Steve, for that excellent talk. Who would like to ask a question? If you would, I think you can. I think the hand raising function works, right? People can turn on their,
to turn their videos on.
Yeah, that would be good. Can people turn their videos on? Do you know, Brandon, or do you have to turn on their videos?
They should, all attendees should be able to unmute and or turn on their videos. Yeah, those should be available. I see at least one person that does have the video capability there, and then everybody should have the ability to unmute. I think we have somebody that just spoke through that unmuted. So please, if you don't have that ability or can't find that ability, please let us know in the chat.
Some people will, and some people will be shy.
There's no need to be shy. None of you can look like me, as someone who was born in the 50s. You're all got to be younger, better looking, spry, in addition to intellectually nimble.
Randy Slaughter, one of our graduate students, has a question. Randy, can you turn your video on?
Is it on, sir?
It is.
Yes, sir, it is on.
There you are.
Okay. Yep, I'm on date night with my wife, but I still had to attend. Sir, do you think in 1975, you said you thought the Chinese situation was more of the most important? Why did you think that, as far as with Iran, you said it was hollow? Why is it hollow?
So thank you for that question. So the Iranian regime today has lost a great deal of its legitimacy. It came to power in a popular revolution, the overthrow of the Shah was a widespread phenomenon in the sense of mass participation. The country was very happy to get rid of the Tsar, and the sense of possibility of a better future, of freedom, of a better standard of living was almost ubiquitous, except for those elites connected to the Shah, most of whom fled. However, if you'll recall, Mr. Slaughter, in June 2009, there were 3 million people protesting the Iranian regime in the streets of Tehran alone. They were attempting to overthrow the Islamic Republic, the Iranian Revolution, and they were Iranian citizens. 3 million courageous people who risked life and limb to march in the streets, and many of them, unfortunately, were beaten to a pulp by the security forces of the Iranian regime, which had condemned the tyranny of the Shah's secret police, the Shah's imposition of tyranny, and here they were being condemned by their own people for those very same attributes 30 years later in June 2009. And we've seen them resort to greater and greater repression, and we've seen a lot of the population voice their disillusionment, especially young people. And so the Islamic Republic, which came to power on a wave of mass enthusiasm and mass hope, has dead-ended and is a hollowing regime, in my view.
Thank you, sir, and I enjoyed your book, Armageddon Averted.
Okay, you're on my list of people. Letters of recommendation. When I need a letter, I'm going to you, Randy. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your date night, and make sure your wife knows how special this
Can
date
you imagine
is.
the guy's with me instead of his wife there? God bless
Yeah.
that woman.
All right, I see Bob Baumgartner has his hand raised. Bob, could you turn on your video as well as your sound? But go ahead and ask your question.
If I can turn it around. Okay. Well, hi, Dr. Kotkin. I'm trying to figure out how to turn this thing around. It's the first time I use this one, this format here.
It's okay. Just go ahead and just talk.
Anyway, the question, Dr. Kotkin, is this. You mentioned the 1979 Iran. Do you think that there's a connection between how Russia perceived the U.S. during Iran-Contra with what was going on in Iran and how it reflected to Russia?
Bob, I think you're onto something here, that Iran, Russia, U.S. is in fact connected, although obliquely. The U.S. supported the Shah. He was our tyrant in the Middle East. Sometimes it's said the ruler is an SOB, but he's our SOB because he supports the U.S. against a communist influence of the Soviet Union. We did support the Shah. We did believe that the Shah was on our side all the way, to the wall. We were late to understand how unpopular the Shah was and how the mass uprising was going to overthrow him. The Soviet Union didn't see the Islamic Revolution in Iran coming either. The Soviet KGB memoirs are pretty honest about how they too were taken by surprise. You'll notice that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan happens also later that year, December 1979, and it's also the Islamists who will come to power eventually, first as an opposition to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and later as the regime that replaces the Soviet puppet state in Afghanistan. The U.S. supported the Islamic regime opposition, the Islamic opposition against the Soviet puppet regime in Afghanistan. So even as we had hostages taken, American citizens taken as hostages in Iran by the Islamist regime, we went on to support Islamic opposition against Soviet rule, Soviet puppet rule in Afghanistan. So all of this was implicated, tied together, and our support for the Islamists in Afghanistan against the Soviets came back to bite us in the butt later on in a very big way. And as you know, we then went into Afghanistan ourselves and repeated many of the same tragic errors at great cost to the Afghan people that the Soviets had committed earlier. And so you don't learn from history this particular way. It's better to take the courses of Brandon and Jim and learn your history so as not to repeat these kinds of mistakes. Learn your anthropology, learn your sociology, learn to respect the fact that you're ignorant of foreign cultures and foreign countries that you think you're going to influence or shape, and instead you're not going to get what you think. You're going to get perverse and unintended consequences, and perverse and unintended consequences, that's a synonym for history.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. And I was one of Jim's students, so I understand.
Good work.
Speaking of perverse consequences of history. Thank you, Bob. That was Bob, I think, taking a picture of himself in the window of his car.
Decent car there, Bob.
We are,
That's
okay.
my daughter and my nephew.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay. You're a generous
All right.
parent there.
Any other questions?
I see a hand up.
Yeah, Jim, we have Robert and Carolina, I believe, have hands up.
Yes.
On the
Let's
list.
go with Carolina first. Could you unmute yourself and, if possible, turn on your camera?
So what is Iran's current role in the Middle Eastern conflict?
Yeah, so Iran has decided that its security is best served by creating havoc, creating chaos, creating destruction in its neighborhood. Iran is an ancient civilization. It's an exquisite culture. It predates the United States by a really long time. It's very admirable what Iran has achieved over the course of more than a millennium. But today, Iran in its neighborhood is a very nasty actor. It supports militias, that is to say, it arms groups inside its neighbors who overthrow or in general attempt coups, create havoc in those countries. We can name Lebanon, we can name Syria, we can name Iraq, all of which the United States has helped to destabilize to a certain extent, for sure. And Iran has made it its policy to destabilize on purpose. The United States didn't want to destabilize Iraq. It wanted to democratize Iraq. Iran wants to destabilize and has done so because it feels that trouble in its neighborhood makes Iran more secure. Iran is also fighting a proxy war with Saudi Arabia, the principal Sunni Arab power in the Middle East, in the country of Yemen, which has been enormously tragic for the Yemeni people, as Iran and the Saudis support different sides in the proxy war. If you put up a map of Shiite Muslims and Sunni Muslims in the Middle East, you would effectively have a map of Iranian influence and Saudi influence stretching beyond their borders in this grudge match, in this struggle to be the regional power. The Saudis, if I could elaborate on this a little bit, The Saudis are very interesting because the great civilization of the Arabs was always Egypt. Egypt had universities in the Middle Ages. Egypt had massive, incredible architecture, mosques, high culture, dating many, many hundreds of years back. And even before that, Egypt had the pharaohs, the pyramids. Cairo was considered the cultural capital of the Middle East. The Saudis are a Bedouin tribe, a desert tribe, but who never had the architecture, the culture, the civilization that the Egyptians were able to produce. But Mother Nature, 300 million years ago, underneath the desert, planted organic life in porous rock, which we know as hydrocarbons, aka oil and gas. And the power in the Middle East on the Sunni side shifted because the Egyptians, despite having this incredible high culture, Arab civilization, didn't have the oil and gas, and the tribal Bedouins in the desert had the oil and gas, and they eclipsed the Egyptians as the great Sunni Arab power in the Middle East. Iran is more interesting even than that because Iran combines both the ancient civilization, Persian culture, cuisine, architecture, literature, music, which stretches way beyond Iran's borders into Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all of Central Asia, Turkey to a certain extent through the Ottoman Empire. Iran has the kind of incredible high culture that the Arabs developed in Egypt, but Iran also has the hydrocarbons underneath the desert that the Saudis have. And so Iran is a formidable country in power, even though the Islamic regime is a dead end for that country, in my view. Iran has both the civilization that the Sunni Arab Egyptians developed in parallel, and the hydrocarbons that the Saudis were lucky to discover underneath the earth, planted by Mother Nature 300 million years ago. The fate of the Middle East will not depend on the Saudi-Iran proxy war struggle. It will depend on your generation's ability to make sure that alternative energy replaces hydrocarbons and reduces the power of regimes like the Saudi regime and the Iranian regime. As soon as clean energy bumps out hydrocarbons, the geopolitics will change very dramatically. And that's not coming immediately. That's coming with your generation and coming in the future.
Thank you.
Bob Taylor had a question.
How you doing, sir?
Very good,
Also, big fan of the book Armageddon Averted. You got a letter of recommendation for me whenever you need it.
Thank you.
You mentioned Russia is back, and I know some people would say maybe the Cold War never really ended, just thawed out a little bit. But what do you think about, tensions ratcheting up between us and Russia, with our last election and the hacking and things like that? Do you think that we could potentially see ourselves in another pretty serious, part of a Cold War? And how far do you think that could possibly go?
Very good question, Bob. Thank you. And I may take that letter at some point. So that's a promise that we have recorded here, Brandon. That's a big one, Bob, just like the Middle Eastern question that Carolina asked. So give me a moment here to unfold it a little bit. This is not the Soviet Union. Russia lost a tremendous amount of territory. It's farther than Central Europe today than at any time since Peter the Great, geographically. It's much weaker in some ways. At the same time, however, there are attributes of Russia that remain, that enable it to punch above its weight. First and foremost, it has really incredible geography. Russia is a European, Middle Eastern, and Far Eastern power simultaneously. It borders on all of those regions, and it impinges on the economics and politics of those places. Secondly, Russia has a very talented population. It has a high level of what we call human capital or education, a talented people, a dynamic, entrepreneurial, educated people. Many of those people have fled the Putin regime because of a lack of freedom, but Russia is able to produce extraordinary people and can't be discounted. In addition, Russia is able to devote very significant resources to its military, greater than its GDP would seem to warrant. Russia has always managed to be a strategic power with a formidable military that its neighbors either don't want to invest in or cannot invest in. Russia has by far the biggest military in its region, with the exception of China, with which it borders in East Asia. It's a formidable military, and we saw it in action, retaking, from the Russian point of view, seizing illegally, from the Ukrainian point of view, the Crimean Peninsula. I could go on. Russia has a veto at the UN. Russia earned that veto at the UN by winning World War II on the Eastern Front against Nazi Germany. And so it retains that UN veto. Russia also has a colossal nuclear arsenal, far bigger than any other country but the United States. So even though Russia's economy is not very large in comparison and shrinking, it's smaller than 1/10 the size of the U.S. economy. The Soviet economy probably was about 1/3 of the U.S. economy at peak. The Russian economy is less than 1/10 of the U.S. economy. And yet, because of these attributes, its geography, its human capital, its investment in military power, its UN veto, its nuclear arsenal, Russia is able to throw a lot more weight around than we anticipated when we thought, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Russia was either finished as a great power or it was going to become like Western Europe, a rule of law, democratic country integrated with the West. So Russia is back looking like Russia, not like our imagination of what Russia was supposed to become. It looks like a power that values its ability to punch above its weight in the international system. U.S.-Russian relations have never been very good, Bob. Even during World War II, when we were allies, there was tremendous friction in the alliance, distrust. And in fact, it was not an alliance that coordinated military activity. There were very severe limits. We fought parallel but separate wars during World War II, even when we were allies. And of course, there was the Cold War, as you alluded to. Bob, this may sound like something a little bit crazy, but I'm in favor of the Cold War, Bob. And I'm in favor of the Cold War because it's better than hot war. The point of Cold War is that you battle in other ways: economic pressure, forming alliances, diplomacy, investing in your own people and your own technology. You fight the Cold War against other countries, and you don't fight the hot war. 55 million people died in World War II, a much greater figure than in World War I even. How do you understand a number like 55 million deaths? And if there's a World War III, Bob, who knows what the number could be? It could be 550 million, now that we have those nuclear weapons that we're talking about. And so Cold War is not such a bad outcome in my mind. When you have fundamental disagreement in state interests, when Russia and the U.S. disagree fundamentally in pursuing what they conceive of as their interests, and even more fundamentally than a clash of state interests, when you have a clash of values, which we have with them. Cold War, to me, looks like a smart strategy, provided it's implemented so as to avoid a hot war and to push U.S. interests where we think they should be, such as defending the freedom of other countries, but acknowledging that other states, even when we don't like their regimes, have state interests too that need to be accommodated in the international system through diplomacy.
Thank you, Bob. I'd like to recognize Josh Gadacht, who is a faculty member in the history department.
Hi, thank you. That was a really excellent talk, and I enjoyed it a lot. I guess, I always tell my students that I'm a little scared of trying to predict the future. It's difficult enough to describe the past or know what happens. But I guess if you look, you kind of describe we're at the end, or we're kind of at the end of the road for three different systems. And you can kind of see this kind of gathering, repression, chaos. You look at China with, its repression of the Uyghurs, and maybe conflict in South China Sea. You look at the proxy wars in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq. You look at the Trump administration in the United States. And just today I saw a conservative MP was killed, murdered. So I guess my question is, are we kind of do you think we're on a path towards kind of this acceleration of this sort of, increased repression, conflict, civil war? Or do you see, you also mentioned kind of a social left force in Britain. Iran has had reformist elements that have tried to contend with power. We've seen protests in the last 2 decades, things going on in the United States. Do you see any kind of opening for reformist elements to kind of come in, or do you kind of see this gathering, path we're on towards more conflict? Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Like you, I'm very bad at predicting the future. It's a lucrative business because you can write futurology, be completely wrong about everything, and then write another book of futurology and sell that too, and not be held to account for the nonsense that you wrote in the earlier book. A futurology, you get to go on TV, and you get to be an ignoramus there too. I wish I were better at predicting the future, Josh. Then I would be able to pay for the education of all the people on this Zoom and then some. I can't do that, and I can't predict the future. So what do I see right now, Josh? What I see right now is an eventual crash of the Iranian and Chinese regimes, which I hope is not violent. I also see corrective mechanisms in the Anglo-American sphere. We have corrective mechanisms that the Iranians and the Chinese lack. We look like we're in really bad shape, but we have the ability through elections, through societal mobilization, through the court system and rule of law, through market economics, to create new businesses and new jobs. We have a lot of really important corrective mechanisms so that even when we back ourselves into a corner, even when we begin to go bad, kind of like you go to the supermarket and you're trying to buy the milk and it says Reagan Thatcher on the milk, but the date is past of when they should be selling it. Or you go there and you see, fill in the blank, the Clinton family, and the date is way past the time it should be sold. I mean, way past. To the extent it should have ever been on the shelf at all is a separate question. So I see the United States as not automatically going to get out of the pickle that we're in, Josh, but having corrective mechanisms which are absent in the Iranian and Chinese case. So I would be more optimistic of solving problems here in the U.S., not optimistic, but more optimistic. Remember, it's better to be a pessimist, Josh, because pessimists, A, are always right, and B, when we're wrong, something good happened. And that's a good thing. It's good to be wrong if you're a pessimist. I would love to be wrong on many of the things I think, because then something good would happen. I would say that the main threat to the world is a world war between China and the United States. That's much greater than the climate change problem, which is very poorly understood. It's much greater than just about every problem except potentially the loss of biodiversity. A war between China and the United States destroys everything in its path, like World War II. And this time with the nukes, it could be, or pathogens, biological weapons, it could be much worse. So I'm good with confrontation between the U.S. and China that doesn't lead to conflict. I'm good with tensions. I'm good with Cold War, but I'm against hot war and everything necessary to avoid hot war without appeasing or capitulating. I would say that we're in an epoch that we didn't foresee, that was introduced by the internet, where everybody became a publisher. Every single person on this Zoom is a publisher. Every single person, whatever education level they have or don't have because they weren't afforded opportunities, they were left behind, they're still a publisher. We discovered this in Brexit. We discovered this with Trump. We discovered that there's a whole lot of people out there who feel left behind, cheated, that the system is rigged. They're angry, they're disappointed, and they're publishers now. They have a voice. They can use that voice. They can become visible in a way that they were invisible before the internet and social media. This has been a massive eruption, and why I think 1979 is ending and something different is coming. If you've seen the book by Martin Gurri, Gurri, it's a difficult read, but it's an amazing book about the implications of the internet revolution, which he foresaw early on about this explosion of the establishments, a blowing open so that the lower orders that were voiceless could erupt onto the scene. Many of the elites don't like the voices that they're now hearing. They call it populist. They call it demagogy. They call it xenophobia. They call it racism. They call it anything but let's listen to these people, hear what they have to say, and figure out what should be done. Donald Trump captured a lot of these people's voices. So did Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was defeated, as you know, in the election primaries by Joe Biden, who they say is still alive. Donald Trump was successful first time around against Clinton because he captured some of these voices that others didn't see. He provided no solutions to the questions that they raised, but he magnified, he amplified those voices, just as Brexit amplified, magnified voices in the UK that had been invisible, inaudible, and suppressed. That's the era, Josh, that we're in, coming to grips with the fact that the masses can speak directly to power now in a way that they couldn't before. We don't understand what they think. We don't seem to like what they think. We don't seem to know how to respond to what they think. But that's the challenge in the democratic world, even more so than in the authoritarian world. I'm not afraid of the authoritarians, Josh. I'm afraid of ourselves failing to use our corrective mechanisms for a better future for those people who have been left behind. And I think that's not just a leftist project. I think that's a rightist project just as much as a leftist project. And I think the center has to be rebuilt in a coalition of left of center and right of center to provide practical solutions to the people, not just to those who are better off and had an amazing pandemic and are afraid of the masses, are afraid of all these self-publishers. So I didn't predict the future, I don't think, Josh, and maybe I didn't even give a good answer, but I sure did fill up several minutes of time there.
Thank you. Bill Kerrigan, a fellow faculty member in the history department, has a question.
Yeah, fascinating talk, and I, like you, lived through 1989 and thought it was quite a big moment, and you've started me to kind of rethinking my own assumptions about that year, and so I really enjoyed your talk. On a side note, you're less convincing on my becoming a pessimist. I'm going to stick with optimism,
Okay.
but I hear you intellectually there. The question that I have is, was it possible for 1989 to be the turning point that we thought it was going to be, or was it never in the cards now looking back? In other words, were there missed moments in time where it might have become the turning point that we who lived through it thought it was going to be? And if so, what were those key moments? Thank you.
Another great question. Thank you for that, Bill. I believe in contingency, not in determinism. There are major structures at play in the world, but I believe that history is about agency plus structure, and contingency plays a really big role in my view of history. So I do believe that there are pathways, there are decisions, there are turning points that don't turn or that turn differently from how we anticipate. I just believe that perverse and unintended consequences are more powerful than we understand, and that the old expression, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, is true in all time, and it was true in 1989, and it's just as true today in people thinking they're going to bring about social justice, and instead they're bringing about illiberalism, left and right. So the way I would say it is this. 1989 was a big moment, but we forgot that there was something called Iranian civilization, Russian civilization, and Chinese civilization. We fantasized, as you'll recall, about a unipolar moment of American power, that everything collapsed, everything went our way, everything was going to be hunky-dory, everything was going to converge towards the U.S. model, and everyone was going to be free. There were maybe going to be some, variations, Swedish social democracy, Danish social democracy, but by and large it was an American world now, and our power was so great. The unipolar moment never happened. It was a complete delusion. The only way you could think about a unipolar moment is if you were ignorant of Russian, Iranian, and Chinese civilization as a starting point. Well, there's a lot more that we're leaving out. We're being a little simplistic here. There's much more that needs to be included in that stuff. But if you understood as a historian, as a scholar, as an educated reader, that there were these big and important places in the world that hadn't vanished, hadn't become like America. They were not Americans. They were Iranians, Russians, and Chinese. And that they had state interests. They had cultural proclivities. They had long legacies in their institutional makeup. And they were not going away, especially since, as we alluded to, they predated America. So our understanding of what 1989 could have been needs to be placed in the context of that larger picture that was not taken at full value, not taken seriously enough. If we put the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians into the picture, I think we get a more complex and more difficult trajectory, but one nonetheless where the U.S. is a little bit less aggressive in its delusions and pushing its model, and a little bit more engaged in diplomacy and finding common interest with those other places. That was a possibility, a slim one, because of the giddiness of that delusion of the unipolar moment. However, having said that, the world today is better than it was in 1979. There are fewer people living in poverty globally. Globalization and the market revolution produced far greater wealth than previously existed. Globalization lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty around the world and lifted several hundred people into the billionaire class in the United States. This is an enormous change. Healthcare is a lot better. Education is a lot better and more widespread. People are living longer and healthier lives globally, despite even the pandemic. Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, for all the condemnation he has brought down upon himself, increasing the sales of his great books. You need to be denounced to sell. Steven Pinker has a point here. The point is not a Pollyannish one, that everything is great and we should just keep doing what we're doing. The point is that we need to recognize our achievements in order not to undo them in the name of doing something better. You know, we had the civil rights era, call it a revolution, call it an uprising in the United States that you lived through just like I lived through. And it was amazing to see. And it had incredible consequences. And it raised by far the standard of living of black people, their ability to vote, their ability to enter the best universities, to get PhDs, to go on to own businesses. It was incredible, the civil rights revolution. It was necessary and it was consequential. But we need to understand that. That's an achievement. We are not back in 1861 or 1865. We're starting from a different point of view, starting from a different reality. So our diagnosis of what needs to happen, our diagnosis of our current state very powerfully informs what needs to happen. And we need to accept the successes of 1989, even as we, in retrospect, understand we exaggerated them. A lot of good has happened. And you don't have to live only in the Baltic states or South Africa or unified Germany to believe that.
Steve, I think that It's about 6:20, and I think that although there are probably further questions, I know that you have to have another appointment, so I think I'm going to declare an end to the questions and to thank you personally.
What about injury time, Jim? Remember that concept from your days at Princeton? Like in
Yes,
soccer, where the ref allows a couple of extra minutes
2 more
somebody
minutes.
went down with an injury during the game.
Extra
Anyway,
time.
we miss you. We miss you at Princeton, Jim. You were an amazing teacher for us. Your students at Rowan are very, very privileged to have an intellect and a dedicated, passionate teacher, a great scholar and teacher like you are. So hats off to you. And Brandon, kudos to you for organizing this kind of format to interact with people. I love interacting with students. I'm really appreciative of the opportunity. If people have further questions, Brandon, what you can do is have them email me. I have 44,500 emails in my inbox right now, but I do my best. I do my best to when people ask me stuff if I know the answer. They were great questions. It's been a privilege to join you. And keep it up, Brandon, a great series like you have.
Thank you, Dr. Kotkin. You're beating me. I only have about 25 back emails right now. So yes, but I will forward that to everybody too. And thank you for sharing, taking the time, almost an hour and a half here on a Friday evening, and sharing your knowledge and your deep historical insights with us. If I may just say one or two more quick things before we go. I believe there was a reference to, I believe it's Revolt of the Public, which is Martin Bury's book.
Yes.
The title of that, his recent book publication. I would also recommend it. It's a nice extension of maybe the dead-end concept that Dr. Kotkin talked about, especially about dissemination of information on the internet, especially by members of the more general public in many different societies, and how that is can be fueling some of this instability globally and those sorts of things. It's a very fascinating work. And of course, to read Dr. Kotkin's and Dr. Heinzen's work as well to understand all of these issues too. So with that, everybody, thank you for the questions. We had a wonderful and decent-sized audience tonight, and thank you, Dr. Heinz and Dr. Kotkin, for being here. And we will see you all next time on the RCBC Global Studies Lecture Series. Have a good evening, folks. Thanks for the interaction tonight.